What do you do? I don't need my picture up. Okay, it somehow seems to move from talk of process to research. I feel like we all need a 60-second break, some soothing, to move into my talk, which would be describing a research project, clinical research project. We're trying to provide an assessment battery, the widest possible scope for post-traumatic distress in infants and young children. There's a great lack of it in the literature. Our age group is between 1.5 and 5. And the kind of post-traumatic distress or disorder, the wide range of symptoms, whether or not they classify for full-blown PTSD, are particular in our region and also in other regions of continuous conflict. They differ from the ones that are usually studied in the literature, except, very few studies focused on PTSD in such young children, and the very few tools to work, and we're trying to develop those. But you think about continuous war and violence. Most of these children are born into it, and it's not single event like a car accident. It's not an experience the child has alone. It's also the family experiences the same trauma. The community experiences the same trauma. So over time, resources of the family, of the community to hold the child are diminished. And this is the kind of children we see. You'll see some examples. I've brought some slides and movies. And we're trying to come up with some kind of assessment battery that can give us some clue to areas of risk and resilience with these children. We work in about 4 or 5 Israeli locations and 5 or 6 Palestinian locations to try to make some sense of what these children are going through in an attempt to provide some sort of screener and eventually treatment. I brought this as a symbol. Perhaps this is a well-known symbol to the horrific 20th century everyone knows. I believe this is the reaction, a picture that describes the reaction to trauma. And what I'd like to stress here, basically what you see in this little figure, I think, is a scream. And around the scream, there is a person. You can't really say that there is a person. What you see is that there is post-traumatic reaction. You see the scream. And when the scream comes from a child who is 2 and 3 and 4, you wonder what kind of self has been developed altogether. If the child is the scream, what is the self? Let's begin step by step. This is the definition for PTSD, and as we go through the definition of what is a traumatogenic event, we know that it needs to involve an actual threat to the self of significant others, and it has to be perceived by the person as threatening. And here we have a case with young children. It has the 3 components. Just to remember the event, we need to know what is the nature of the event, what is the severity of the event, who else was injured, how repetitive is the event, how close the child was, let's say, to the bombing, to the shooting. The 3 types of symptoms, soon we'll see how they are: the re-experiencing, avoidance, and hyperarousal, and the following functional impairment. And only if these 3 components are in place can we talk about post-traumatic disorder, functional impairment in the work domain, social relationship, cognitive functioning, and regulatory functioning. Now when we come to PTSD in infants and young children, we look at the first module, the event. Can young children accurately perceive a real threat to self and other? And we have several incidents in our sample where children were really held at gunpoint. A story of a mother who was driving and people came shooting in her The mother felt the threat of the trauma. The child was sitting in the back seat, apparently didn't feel anything. And the most important piece is, given the children do experience the continuous threat and trauma, how do they tell us about it? Could they provide an accurate verbal account of the traumatic event? The answer is no. So we have to look for other means to see what this child actually experienced and how does he make sense of his experience. When it comes to the symptoms, we'll talk about it soon, but when we come to the functional impairment, we're talking about a child whose functions are still evolving. So how could we really talk about functional impairment? Some of these children are just beginning to talk, beginning to form social relationship, regulatory function, executive functions kicking at that age, attention, focused attention, self-regulation. So we're talking about a very, very dynamic period. So how do we define functional impairment at that age group? And we have to look at what is going on at this age: the cognitive skill, language, inhibitory functioning, the ability to symbolize, which, by the way, is the first to go from the play of young children experiencing trauma. The whole world of creativity and symbolization really is diminished. Peer relationship, which are first, but at this age, initiation, mastery, competence, and daily living skill. So remember, we're talking about children who are, as they are experiencing trauma, have to develop all these crucial skills. And as to the clusters, this is a DC 0 to 3 classification of PTSD in young children. We need to see at least one symptom from 4 clusters, not 3 clusters. The re-experiencing, and the child can show it in many, many different ways, sometimes in movements, as you'll see later, sometimes in syllables, sometimes in body posture, the avoidance. A lot of children stop going to the playground, stop going to kindergarten. They avoid food that they used to eat before and begin to eat only certain foods. Hyperarousal and fears and aggression, which is much more common a reaction to PTSD, to trauma in our age group than in the older. Okay, and we do need to observe the child, and what we want to see the child is in as many contexts as possible in order to see how the child functions in the real ecology, in his own home, with his mother, with someone else from his culture, with his friends. But seeing the child in action is crucial because children cannot give us accurate account, and the assessment of developmental regression falls into 2 functions that children did acquire and lost, and age-appropriate functions that children somehow never were able to develop in the context of continuous trauma. Okay, our model begins with as broad a model as possible, and we believe that it's a cross-cultural, it's an Israeli and Palestinian study, and we believe that post-traumatic reaction has to be studied within its cultural context in a bioecological model. So we talk about the ecology of infant development and the ecology of infant development under continuous war, terror, and violence. We begin with a lower level, which is biological disposition. In our study, we genotype the children, and we check for temperament, especially the 2 components of temperament, reactivity and regulation, and we look at dysfunction of specific systems. I'll show you some results from the HBA axis, but we do some others. On top of child biology, there is the next level, which is the parent-child relationship, the holding environment where the child learns how to relate to the world, and here we have issues of parental psychopathology, attitude to child rearing, interaction around developmentally salient tasks, and the family microsystem, fathers, larger families, which are very important as resiliency factors. The community, which has a very important function as resilient in the context of trauma, peer relationship, neighborhood school, and non-parental adults. And overarching is the culture, which has to do with cultural values and family composition, interactive patterns that are different in each culture and reflect the cultural meaning systems, what is important in each culture. And here is the risk and resiliency model, a multi-risk model. We can only study infant PTSD in the context of multi-risk. Does the child have specific biological disposition? What is happening in terms of parental psychopathology? What is the nature of the parent-child interaction, etc.? And also a study that Shafik and I did, published early this year, shows that specific risk conditions function differently, have different outcome in the Israeli and Palestinians. For instance, maternal depression has a lot worse effect on Israeli children that live in nuclear families. In Palestinian extended family living, when the mother is depressed, there's someone else of a kin relationship. But social support system, the nature of the social support system, had a much greater effect on Palestinian children. So different risk and resilient factors would have an effect on child outcome depending on the culture. Okay, and these are, I'll skip through them, these are all kinds of biological, physiological measures that we take and others know that have effect on PTSD. And this is a model that we won't go into, beginning with the event, proximal reminders of the event, the acute distress of the child, resilience, adaptive functioning, and all this we want to take into consideration. And now we come to our study. Here is the, so far we've seen 210 Israeli and Palestinian families, so we can say something a little bit more there. We want to collect more young children, but we feel we have enough of a sample that the result can mean something. These are the Israeli locations. Sderot and the area around Sderot is the Israeli towns and kibbutzim and villages that are near Gaza that are usually receive Scud missiles either daily or weekly, but repeatedly. Gush Katif was the Jewish settlers in Gaza before they were evacuated, so we saw children there. The children in Tel Aviv, we used them as control, and children of the Galilee after last summer's war in Lebanon. In the Palestinian group, we see children in Nablus, in East Jerusalem, this is our control, in Ramallah, Jenin, and Hebron. What do we do? 1 or 2 home visits. We want to see the children in their ecology. Also, these are families that don't usually have resources to come to our lab, and we do observation of mother-child interaction and child interaction with the experimenter. We conduct an interview, and this is a way we basically, in order to diagnose PTSD, you have to see the child's reaction to the evocation of trauma. And the way we do it is that we discuss the trauma with the mother and we videotape the child. And we see what the child is doing. And we code for the affect and the gaze and the body movement. And you'll see very different nonverbal reaction to the mothers talking about the trauma. We take various physiological measures, saliva and with genotype, and their self-reports. Okay, the first thing we do is that mother and child free play with toys. We have a pre-selected set of toys that we know from many studies that work, and we use our own global coding system that give us these 8 constructs: maternal sensitivity, limit setting and intrusiveness, child involvement, compliance and withdrawal, and dyadic reciprocity and tension. And here I want to bring you just very briefly to one good interaction when mother and child are in synchrony, reciprocity, talk, use the toys together, and 2 interactions where one mother is more intrusive, the mother is more avoidant. Okay, the child initiates, the mother responds, they are doing something symbolic together. This is an interaction when the mother and child play, but each one plays his own game. So they're very okay. And the last one is an example of basically no play. So this often happens with traumatized children, that they use the toys. If they use it in a functional way. There's no real imagination, creativity, play coming out. The next set is interaction with a stranger, and from all child pathology we've seen many in our lab. PTSD has the greatest disparity between play with mother and play with stranger. Children are petrified by a stranger, and note that the stranger is from the same community. So here is a child playing, after playing quite nicely with a mother, there's a stranger. Okay, there's very little ability to engage the child with a stranger. The child clings to the mother. This is the kind of behavioral reaction we see often with children that have been exposed to violence. What we do here is to check socialization and compliance. We ask the mother to ask the child to pick up the toys. A toy pickup session is something known and researched to elicit children's self-regulatory and socialization capacity. And this child is doing it willingly and okay. This is micro-coded for socialization and self-regulation. And the next, about 45 minutes to an hour, is maternal interview on infant PTSD. And it covers the whole 3 modules that you saw before. The event, the nature of the event, what was it for the mother, for the father, for the child, how repetitive the event, how close the child is to the event. Then we go through all the symptoms, many questions that are age-related. We go through behavior by behavior. There may be 150 items of what is re-experiencing, what is hyperarousal, what is avoidance, how was the child before, how is the child now, etc., etc. And then the issues of developmental regression in all those domains that I told you that are important for children at this age. And we videotape the child. So here I brought to you to see about 5 prototypical reaction to children, and these are micro-coded for non-verbal behaviors of children, while the mother is talking with the experimenter, with a clinician, about the trauma. So the first one is the cry reaction. Sometimes we have petrified reaction. Child decomposes.
يعني أكثر حكيتي إنه لما الجيش طاح بقى فيها صار مثل إنه يحس إنه الجيش إنهم صار يحكي لكم الجيش طاحوني الجيش بعدين.
This reaction also has the benefit of stopping, at least momentary, talking about the trauma. These are kind of mechanisms or tactics children use to stop this talking from going on. The other reaction is a regressive reaction. Child went and hello. Okay, this is a reaction that comes again and again, this regressive reaction in various forms. Children take the fetal position, take a pacifier. This child doesn't usually take a pacifier. She went back to using a pacifier. She brought her own pillow and she's cuddling. This is an avoidant reaction. And look at this picture.
אני מרגישה צורך, כי אני הרגשתי שכאילו השכונה שלנו מוקפת. כאילו זה יכול לבוא, אם זה בא מפה. וזה ממש קרוב, תראי כמה נקודות. שתי הגנים, זה מזדרב כולו יורדת. שתי הגנים. הרמזור, הפיק, ועוד אחד שהיה, ותראה הכל.
Okay, hyperactive reaction. Child moves around, maybe to divert the speaker's attention from or his own attention from what's going on. Okay, and over anxious verbal reaction, and this is a reaction of the mother involving the child, not being able to separate herself from the child and talk about to the experience to the clinician, but involving the child repeatedly in reenacting the trauma. It's actually the mother causing the child, and it's also something that we see clinically in various ways.
שנופל לנו שיל קסמורת, מה זה עושה? רצה. מה זה עושה? בום? בום. בום, נכון. ולאיפה אוריאל רץ? רצה. לאן אוריאל רץ? למקלחת, נכון? מה זה עושה?
She's making him run to the toilet where he should run when they're
אין שחר אדום אבל בוא, לא קורה כלום.
She's telling him Shachar Adom. Shachar Adom is a code that is said when there are bombs coming in. So she's reenacting it with him, and he's running to the toilet. And then she has to tell him, no, but it's not really. Then the next thing we do is we check for children reactivity and regulation. This is a well-known Goldsmith's procedure. And children are presented with different masks, and we examine their behavioral response to the scary mask. And the masks go from simple clown mask to a more scary mask. And this is a child that has well-contained regulated reactions. Okay, she's laughing at it. And the next child from Nablus, he is not able to contain. And physiology, we take cortisol for baseline reactivity and recovery. Okay, and genes, etc. And the final thing we do in the meeting is to do with a mother reading the child, the co-construction of narrative. Mother read a child, a very, very famous cultural book. The Hebrew book is a book I'm familiar with. I read it to my kids. My mother read it to me. It's about 5 balloons that blow up one after the other. The Arab book also has to do with some kind of loss or blowing. And these are mothers reading the story to their children. You see how they give a framework to the child. Okay, so this is very important to see whether the mother tells the story together with the child, or there's some kind of synchrony, co-construction, or not. And again, here
بعض الحيوانات والطيور والأطفال.
الأرنب والكلب.
هلا استنى شوي. نظر الأرنب.
So both mothers were framing the narrative for the children, and this is how we end. And also we give self-report of mother PTSD and anxiety and depression, social support, and child problems, and externalizing and internalizing symptoms. Okay, and here to the finding that we have so far as of last week. Well, we found between the, and remember in each group, the Israeli and Palestinian Palestinians, we have exposed group and control group. The control group are culturally matched children, age, SCS, birth order, but were not exposed. So what we see is differences in the re-experiencing cluster, in the avoidance cluster, and in the fears of aggression clusters, and we couldn't find significant differences for the hyperarousal cluster, which was very strange. So we took it apart to see what kind of symptoms go into the hyperarousal cluster, and I'll show you these in a minute. In terms of developmental regression, we see marked differences between exposed and non-exposed children, and the findings are similar for two cultures: general distress, general fear index, and social relationship. Now what we did to examine what's going on with the hyperarousal is to divide it to 4 categories. The first one was arousal, and this included symptoms like unable to fall asleep or wake up several times at night, management or regulation of arousal, and that showed differences between groups. The second symptom cluster in the hyperarousal category was attention. So child moves around a lot, like the child you saw, unable to focus, unable to concentrate, also showed differences. Third cluster was cry. Children cry often, not easily consoled, and here we didn't see differences. There are 2 interpretations that I thought of, but I'd like to hear your response. First, if you look at the standard error of the means, they're very large. It's probably a measure that has large individual variation, probably temperamentally based. The other interpretation that someone in my group said is that we are living in a traumatized society, and probably most of our children cry a lot. There's some trauma in the 2 societies, and if we would have checked them in more peaceful regions, we would have found that all our children, the exposed and non-exposed, there are some studies with adolescents and adults in Israel that show that PTSD reaction go through the media and are there even for children who are not living in the front line. So that may be another explanation. Irritable, we also didn't find differences, and that also could be related to the large standard error and the large individual variation, or to the fact that we raise hyperactive, tense, and irritable children. Okay, the next set of analysis, we looked at age differences. So we have the younger children, age 1.5 to 3, and the older children, age 3 to 4.5, 5. And what we see is that across all domains, the older group shows more symptoms in the re-experiencing, more developmental regression, and more general distress. Now, I'd love to hear what you think about it. We see it across the board again and again. We saw it a couple of years ago when the sample was smaller. We see it again now. Could be that older children have developed more, so their aggression, there's more to regress from. Another option is that older children are more verbal, and that younger children express their distress in ways that are not verbal, and parents pay less attention to their distress. And this is why we're going to go through micro-level coding of all these behaviors that you saw to detect what is the way that younger children express their distress. And could be there need to be some cognitive capacities that kick in at the 3-year-old stage so that children can experience distress. But what is the answer to the fact that across the board we see in both cultures and many segments of the sample older children showing more distress? I'm not sure. Here what you see is a very close link. This is no news to you, and it's been reported but not reported for such young children, that there are very close links between all symptom clusters and what's going on with the mothers. Maternal depression, maternal anxiety, and maternal PTSD directly correlates with all symptoms in the children, and which shows that our mothers are, as much as the mother is unable to contain the child and she's in distress herself, in depression, with a sense of lack of resources, children will develop more symptoms. Okay, and this is also showing that PTSD symptoms are closely linked to the child externalizing and internalizing. In a way, this is construct validity for our measures. Here are cortisol results, and what we see in cortisol, remember we have the 3 points, baseline, after the PTSD interview and the mask, which are stressful, 20 minutes later, and then at baseline. And what we see is that we don't get differences in initial levels, but we do get differences in reactivity. So the 2 measures you see here are delta cortisol, meaning time 2 minus time 1. How much change? So a normal reaction would be that cortisol should go up and then should go down in a nice delta pattern. And what we see, a certain flat pattern for our mothers and for our children. And that shows that the HPA axis is not responsive as it should to stresses. And what we know both from animal and human studies is that those patterns, once they kick in early childhood, tend to persist later on. So these are very scary finding in a sense that children could develop some kind of physiological deficiency of the stress response. Okay, what we see here in terms of internalizing and externalizing symptoms between exposed and not exposed, that at initial assessment but not at follow-up. I forgot to mention that 1-year follow-up we do on these children. We see differences in internalizing symptoms. We don't see differences in externalizing. From the few children we saw at time 2, we see differences also in externalizing symptoms. And these are the factors from the mother-infant interaction that you see very big differences between the mother-child interaction at play. Mothers and children are much less able to play in a reciprocal manner. So mothers are less sensitive, more intrusive, show more anxiety at play. Children are much less involved in play, and the level of dyadic reciprocity is much lower in exposed children. And this shows that for the 45 children that we were able to see at follow-up, symptoms, PTSD symptoms, tend to persist over time. It's between 1 and 1.5 year follow-up of the same PTSD interview, measures of mother and child, and also we do the Vineland. But what is striking is that children have their habitual way of responding to trauma. So re-experiencing will correlate to re-experiencing, and avoidant to avoidant, and hyperarousal to hyperarousal. And that highlights the fact that a child gets into a pattern of reaction to trauma, and that pattern persists. Probably it's the integration of physiological, contextual determinants. And that really gives us a strong sense that some intervention has to go in very soon, so that to break that cycle of that pattern of response to stress, to what is going on. And to conclude, assessment of PTSD in young children requires a complex person and context, multi-risk biobehavioral model. Negative effects of repeated war, terror, and violence are observed in all domains of development. Older children show more symptoms, and the question is, do younger children express distress in other ways that we somehow don't know yet to detect or to evaluate or to treat? Because PTSD symptoms persist over time, there's a great need for early intervention. And perhaps one of the central issues that we should focus our research effort on is resilience. How do resilient factors protect young children? And here we can relate to cultural meaning systems, family networks, physiological regulatory systems, and the lifelong strength derives from a synchronous parent-child relationship. Thank you, and thanks to the agency.